So I start out with Ross, and thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you so much, EJ. Thank you for having me, and I want to thank the whole panel for putting up with having an almost complete political neophyte join this incredibly distinguished group. So essentially, my friend Raihan and I have written a book that tries to address the question that was actually on everyone's lips, I think, in a certain respects after the 2004 election, but of what has made the American working class, and especially the white working class, vote more conservative over the past 35 years. And this was the constituency that formed the heart of the old New Deal majority, and then has swung somewhat like a pendulum towards Republicans, away from Republicans, towards Republicans, away from Republicans, forming the core of Nixon's silent majority, of the famous Reagan Democrats, of Newt Gingrich's angry white men in the 1994 election, and frankly, the core of George W. Bush's support in 2000 and 2004. And our book was written sort of in argument with two theories of American politics of the past few decades, one on the left and one on the right. The leftward theory belongs to actually a lot of authors, but it's become most associated with Thomas Frank, whose book, What's the Matter with Kansas, I imagine most of you are familiar with. Frank's thesis, roughly speaking, is that over the past few decades, the Republican Party has tricked working class America, duped them into voting against their economic interests by summoning up a host of culture war boogeymen, starting in the civil rights era and continuing through the debates about abortion, gay marriage, funding for the National Endowment for the Arts. Pick a culture war battle. It's cited in Frank's argument, and essentially his core contention is that over this period, the American working class has been steadily immiserated by Republican policies, even as they've continued to vote loyally for Republicans and received nothing in return on issues like abortion, gay marriage, and the broader culture wars. So that's the argument that sort of is to our left. The argument to our right, I think you might call it sort of Goldwater purism in a sense. It's the view that the Republican Party lost in 1964 with a staunchly anti-government message from Barry Goldwater because the country wasn't ready for that message yet. That it won in 1980 with Ronald Reagan because the country was ready for that message and because Reagan was a better messenger, and that the history of the conservative movement and the Republican Party and that sort of intertwined dance over the past 2 decades has been a history of deviations from that Reagan-Goldwater essential ideal leading to electoral defeat and returns to that Reagan-Goldwater tradition leading to electoral success. So against those two theses, Raihan and I basically argue that the best way to understand the conservative majority and conservative success in American politics of late, and especially conservative success with working class voters, is as a response to failures of liberal governance in the 1960s and 70s, and as a response to voters' needs, but especially working class American voters' desire for a conservatism that aims to reform the welfare state in ways that reflect the aspirations and values of working class Americans, and that the Republican Party actually rose to power on a very specific set of issues that go directly to the socioeconomic concerns of working class America, against the frank contention that Republican positions have nothing to do with those concerns, and those issues ranging from the tax burden on middle and working class Americans in the 70s and 80s to the explosion of crime from the 60s through the early 1990s to the sense of a failed welfare bureaucracy that was both, essentially taking money away from hardworking American taxpayers and spending it on programs that didn't work and in fact exacerbated the problems they were meant to solve. And then obviously national security concerns and the Cold War and so on. And what we argue is that, part of the reason that conservatism has found itself in such difficulties over the past 5 or 10 years is that the movement is, on all of these fronts, a victim of its own success. Crime rates are far lower than they were during the rise of the conservative majority. Welfare has been fairly successfully reformed in a bipartisan fashion, but one driven by I think it's fair to say, a conservative push for reform. Obviously, the Soviet Union has ceased to exist, and the tax burden, especially the income tax burden specifically on most middle and working class Americans, is dramatically lower than it was when Republicans first came to power. What this means is that Republicans don't have anymore an agenda of what you might call welfare state reform. And they're left with the agenda of welfare state shrinkage. And that's an agenda that conservatives have always had a much harder time selling. And what we've actually seen, I think, over the past, over the Bush administration is an attempt to come to grips with that problem, in a sense, and craft a new conservative agenda that returns to the tradition of welfare state reform that I think animated the conservative majority during its rise to power. Obviously, that push has been somewhat less than successful, especially politically speaking, and I think that there are many respects in which it's fair to say that Bush-style compassionate conservatism has been as much of a dead end as the sort of strident, more strident anti-government push of the Republican majority in the middle 1990s. But so our book essentially says the challenge for conservatives is, you can either, how to be essentially a right-of-center party in a country that isn't driven by, animated by enormous hostility to the welfare state, as the U.S. was to a greater degree in the late 70s and 1980s, and whether it's possible to craft a conservatism that's aimed at the interests and aspirations of the working class voters who've become the heart of the conservative majority, and whether it's possible to take conservatism's current majority among white working class voters and expand it to include Latino, Asian Americans, and even African American working class voters. And that's the political challenge on which I think the future of conservatism depends. So that's sort of the sort of arc of the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book, I don't want to get too deep into the policy weeds, but is essentially, it's essentially an attempt to throw out probably a ton of sometimes contradictory possibilities for directions that conservatives could take domestic policy that would be responsive to what we see as the big challenges facing working class America, challenges that have their heart at the intersection, we argue, of family breakdown, social immobility and insecurity that's driven in turn by the rise of the meritocracy and the rising gulf between Americans with college degrees and those without, and the broader challenges of the global economy. And we spend a lot of time talking about how conservatives can take the ideals of social conservatism, the ideals of sort of a pro-family politics, and apply them beyond the debates over abortion and gay marriage to the tax code. How do you have a family-friendly tax code? How do you have a more family-friendly healthcare system? What would it mean to be more family? Should we think, for instance, of issues like infrastructure and quality of life in terms of their impacts on family formation and family stability, and so on? So that's sort of the arc of the second half of the book. And does that seem like a good summary from which to start? Or
It does indeed. I hope we can press a little bit on where this leads in terms of policy a little bit later in the discussion, but I think that's an excellent summary.